So first of all, I'd like to echo everybody else in congratulating the International Centre on Human Rights and Drug Policy, UNDP, UNAIDS and WHO, on the launch today of the world's first guidelines on drug policy and human rights. I'd like to especially thank Judy and Chang for their role in this process and for their commitment to meaningful community involvement throughout the process by working closely with INPUD. So INPUD, we are the international network of people who use drugs. We're a global peer-based organisation that seeks to promote the health and defend the rights of people who use drugs. We work to challenge stigma, discrimination and the criminalisation of people who use drugs and its impact on the drug community's health and rights. So the guidelines being launched today are of huge significance for our community. Prohibition has simply become a matter of life and death for people who use drugs, and many of us are left literally fighting for survival. The cause of this problem is clear to our community. The problem being the international drug control system. That is, the 3 drug control treaties. Their interpretation and application undermine the human rights treaties. In the words of Paul Hunt, former Special Rapporteur on the right to health, the drug control and human rights system must cease to behave as though they exist in parallel universes. Criminalisation of drug use and the people who use them have led to the following rights violations. 1, the right to health. There are more than 200,000 drug-related deaths a year. As mentioned by others before me on the panel, overdose deaths contribute to between 1/3 and half of all drug-related deaths. Last year in the US alone, there were 71,000 deaths. Since 2008, 4,000 people have been executed for so-called drug offences. 35 jurisdictions retain the death penalty. And the most damning statistic of all, there have been 27 extrajudicial killings of people who use drugs that have taken place in the drug crackdown in the Philippines. There are reports of more of these happening across the region. It undermines the right to health. Among the estimated 15.6 million people who inject drugs, HIV and HCV prevalence is 17.8% and 52% respectively. Despite this heavy burden, it is estimated that only 10% of our community have access to harm reduction programs. This is due simply to moral judgment and a lack of political will in addressing our needs. It violates the right to freedom from cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment. Currently, 450,000 people who use drugs are illegally detained in compulsory drug detention centres across 7 Southeastern Asian countries. Numerous other unregulated private rehab facilities are carried out in the name of treatment, including in Nepal and some countries in Latin America. It undermines the right to due process and fair trial. 1 in 5 prisoners are incarcerated for drug offences, and most of these are for possession of drugs for personal consumption. We know that these laws are discriminatory, both in their application and their intent. Many of us know that the very first laws targeting drug use, that is against opium use, were used against Chinese migrant populations and communities. And that is a community that I come from also. Today, the criminal justice system continues to discriminate in the application of drug control laws against people of colour, women and other minorities. It undermines the right to be free from discrimination. The majority of us face lives decimated by stigma and are traumatised due to the stigma and social exclusion and marginalisation that we face, and we are either ignored, silenced or vilified. So the guidelines are particularly significant for people who use drugs because we have been advocating for a rights-based approach for years. A rights-based framework shifts the world from framing people who use drugs as simply needing rescue, welfare or charity, but recognises us as citizens deserving of the same fundamental dignity and freedoms as anyone else. It means we have the right to self-determination, so we have the right to organise, build and register networks free from harassment and intimidation from authorities, and have the right to determine the direction of our movement and values as a community. We do not need more people working for or on behalf of our community, but rather with our community, by giving us platforms where we can have our voice, set our own agendas, and shape our futures and provide us with the necessary tools. In 2015, INPUD produced a consensus statement on drug use under prohibition. So this consensus statement is the declaration on the inherent rights of people who use drugs. It's a result of 4 regional consultations with representatives of 24 drug user organizations from 28 countries. So this consensus statement was integrated and shared with the human rights guidelines. So they will also reflect the consensus statement. I'll just read one quote from the consensus statement, and this is an excerpt from a respondent from the Delhi Network of Positive People. They see people who use drugs as not a human being. Even though I put some amount of chemical or whatever in my body, it doesn't mean that I'm not a human being anymore. I'm still a human being. But the way people treat us, the way the country treats us, the way policy treats us, the way government treats us, is completely inhuman. So in 2018, a consultation on the human rights and drug policy guidelines were held on the margins of the AIDS conference in Amsterdam, and that happened with support of UNDP and the International Center on Human Rights and Drug Policy. There were 20 drug user representatives from around the world, some of whom are in this room, and they gathered to input into the last iteration of the guidelines. We were able to make recommendations on some of the content under public health, gender and indigenous peoples, and criminal justice, and also made recommendations on the style and format. So community in attendance at this community consultation were very excited about these guidelines, as we felt that we potentially had a set of guidelines that would be speaking to our wants and needs and really grounded in the human rights approach. So I'll just finish up with a quote from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. Disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief, and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. This universal declaration precedes the advent of the drug control system. The human rights system was created to prevent the atrocities of the Second World War from ever happening again. They are a measure designed to mitigate human-designed disasters and commit the world to work together for peace and well-being. The war on drugs has continued for over 50 years. The cost has been millions of lives, and like all wars, it doesn't just damage those directly involved, but impacts families and generations to come. So our message is that the war on people who use drugs must end, and with decriminalisation of drug use being the first critical step. So I just want to thank all the people who have worked to develop the guidelines and for reminding us that human rights takes precedence over drug control and thus must align with rights norms. So looking towards the future, we will work with the University of Essex and UNDP when and where needed, and advocate for the implementation of the world's first guidelines on human rights and drug policy. We hope that those who hold decision-making power see as we do that these guidelines are a blueprint for change. Thank you.
Thank you.